right. My name is Jordy Izzard, and I'm Associate Director of Alumni Relations here at SAIS. And I'm here today with Bruce Benton, who graduated from SAIS with his MA in 1968. And today's date is February 27th, 2014, and we're so glad to have you here. We're just going to have a little bit of a conversation, and why don't we just start with what originally brought you to SAIS?
Well, I'm from the Midwest, and I went to a small undergraduate school, Kalamazoo College, we had a foreign study program, and nearly everybody in the junior year went overseas, and I studied in France, and this was 1962, 63. Mm-hmm. Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy was president. And it was pretty exciting time to be abroad. And I really hadn't been out of the Midwest hardly. And I decided from that experience that I really wanted to go on in international affairs. So I came back my senior year and I applied to SAIS. I also applied to Fletcher School. And at the same time I applied to go in the Peace Corps. And my French was pretty strong because I had been a student at the University of Aix-en-Provence in France, and so it was pretty much determined that if I went to the Peace Corps I would go to Africa, a French-speaking country in Africa. And when I got accepted in the Peace Corps, I wrote to SAIS and Fletcher and I asked if they could delay my coming in for 2 years until I finish up my assignment in the Peace Corps. And Fletcher said no, and SAIS said yes. So that was perfect for me because I went on into the Peace Corps in Guinea, where I was a teacher of English as a foreign language and math and physical ed. And but I was all set up with my plans to come back in '66 and start my MA at SAIS. So that's how I started, mm-hmm. And while I was here... Mm-hmm.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about what you remember about being a student.
Those years were rather incredible. The Vietnam War was building up and going strong, and there were some demonstrations against the war here in Washington, and a lot of the SAIS students participated in those, including myself. SAIS was also had begun an African Studies program, and I was just coming out of Africa, and very much interested in that. And there weren't many African Studies programs at that time because really Africa had just become independent during the years '60 to '64, and so those programs were just beginning. And I did take a lot of African Studies courses, and there was quite a bit of enthusiasm in that area studies program because Africa was newly independent. But most of all, it was kind of exciting just to be in Washington during those years, and of course '68 was a big year because it was an election year. Also, you had some assassinations that occurred during that year, Martin Luther King, and you had the Washington riots, and I was living just across the street from SAIS, and we were barricaded in our house for several days, where we saw these military trucks going down the street, and then of course we had the assassination of Robert Kennedy, and then the build up to the Democratic and Republican conventions in that summer. One of the things that was on the minds of many students, at least the men, was the fact that was the Vietnam War and the fact that we could be drafted. And I realized that was a big concern of mine, and when I graduated in '68, I was thinking to myself, I'd like to continue on in my studies, hopefully get a deferment, and avoid having to go to Vietnam, because I was quite opposed to the war.
I interviewed somebody this morning who actually said the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I got accepted to the University of Michigan in economics, in a PhD program. And I consulted with some of the economics professors here at SAIS as to what school to go to. I actually got in Michigan and Ohio State, and they convinced me to go to Michigan, even though I had less money from Michigan. So I went on to Michigan in economic development, and they had a program there which focused on African economic development, which was perfect for me. So I continued on in economics, and I also felt while I was at SAIS that economics was extremely important for my being able to get the kind of positions I would like to have long-term in economic development. And while SAIS was very good in African studies and had some economics courses, I felt I needed more. And so I was able in the end to couple that with a degree from Michigan. I never finished the PhD. I went all the way through the coursework, and then I left. But I came back to Washington because living in Washington was so attractive to me during my SAIS years that I just had to come back. So in 1970, I came back.
Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about, when you came back to Washington and you had your MA, and it sounded like you went through most of your PhD. How did your career start from that point?
Well, I started out in the federal government, Department of Agriculture. They had an international program that focused on trade negotiations, and this was at the time that the European Union was being established, and those years 71 to 73 were the times that Britain, Ireland, and Denmark were going into the common market, and as a result there had to be trade negotiations with the U.S. to GATT negotiations, and there were some concessions that needed to be provided to the U.S. because the tariffs and non-tariff barriers on trade goods from Britain, Denmark, and Ireland were going to go up when they came into the common market. So then I worked on those negotiations, those trade negotiations, while I was at USDA, and then the Deputy Assistant Secretary from the Department of Agriculture moved to Treasury and took me with him. And I continued to work on the trade negotiations, but as a Treasury person. And I finally went over to Geneva and participated in those negotiations for 6 months in 1973. And that was a very exciting experience for me. Then I came back and continued on at Treasury, where I went in the Office of Raw Materials and Oceans Affairs, which basically had to do with the Law of the Sea Treaty and the possibility of commodity agreements in a number of raw materials, such as copper and tin and wheat. And so I participated in those discussions. Those were called UNCTAD discussions, and I was going back and forth from Treasury to Geneva to participate in the UNCTAD negotiations on commodity agreements, and that was fascinating for me. And then I did that for about 1.5 years, 2 years maybe, and then I got pulled over into the office. I was offered the job as Deputy Director of the Multilateral Development Banks in Treasury. And Treasury is the lead agency for the development banks, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the African Development Bank. And so I was the Deputy Director of that office, where we set the policies for the U.S. in each of those development bank institutions, and we instructed the executive directors for each of those institutions how to vote on various policy issues or projects which would come to the board. And
I'm sure never a dull moment.
No, that was very exciting, and I also had to do what I could to get the U.S. contributions passed in Congress for each of the international development banks, and they would be coming up annually. And that was probably what I focused on the most. The IDA negotiations, particularly for the World Bank, which are always a big issue in the appropriations subcommittee in the House, and we were able to get the IDA 4 agreement passed while I was in the Treasury, and then from there I received a congressional fellowship from the American Political Science Association, and there was a subgroup for those fellowships, which was international, and I was the only one from Treasury that was picked to be in that group. Most of the other participants were from state, CIA. There was one from Commerce, and USAID, and I was able to spend 6 months in a House member's office and 6 months on the Senate side, and so and the preparations for those assignments took place here at SAIS, where SAIS had a professor who was a guru on congressional affairs, Professor Fred Holborn, and he knew just about everybody on the House side and the Senate side. He had encyclopedic knowledge of everybody, and he would advise us, depending on our interests, who we might seek a job with. And I was getting my Treasury salary, so I was a free good on the House and Senate sides. And I went in, I picked the ranking member in the House Appropriations Committee, Silvio Conti from Western Massachusetts, and he had a vote on the Foreign Operations Subcommittee, which is where I had been doing a lot of the work when I was at Treasury. And so I was able to follow up in Congress to see those things passed on the House side. And then I moved over, after about 6 months there, I moved over to the Senate, and I worked in the office of Senator John Chafee from Rhode Island, where I was working on the Appropriations Committee and also the Defense Authorization Committee, and I became his defense expert for the 6 months I was there. And then Silvio Conti's office wanted me to come back, so I went back for another year to continue to work in Congressman Conti's office. And while I was there, he had good contacts in the World Bank, and I applied to the World Bank, and he strongly supported my going on to the World Bank. And I did apply and got interviewed, and eventually received a note from the President of the World Bank that they would like to have me come over and work in their evaluation department, where I would look at the various policies of the World Bank, do reports on those policies and the impact they were having in developing countries, and write up the reports for the bank board of executive directors. And then I also did what was called program loans, major loans to change the policies broad policies within developing countries to make them more acceptable to the bank in terms of finance and budget needs, and as well as long-term development. And so I looked at a number of program loans and wrote up reports. And I also looked at projects in terms of their long-term impact after they were completed, to see what the impact was 5-10 years after the project was completed. And those are really fascinating studies to do, because it gave and the reports were read around the bank, and it gave the bank staff a sense as to whether there was sustainability built into these projects to keep them going beyond the life of the project. And that, of course, is very important for long-term development.
Sure.
And while I was there, I was offered the job of taking over the responsibility for what was called the onchocerciasis control program, or the river blindness control program for Africa. And that was something I was excited to do. When I first heard about it, I didn't really think that river blindness was an important problem, at least not as important as HIV/AIDS or malaria. But the more I looked into it, I realized that although this hadn't gotten a lot of visibility, it was really a critical problem, particularly for the countries in the Sahel region of West Africa, and the rural areas where this disease was rampant and was preventing communities from thriving and from inhabiting the best land in the areas where they were living, because the disease was so prevalent. River blindness is transmitted. It's a parasitic disease which is transmitted by a fly, and once it's transmitted to someone, it's passed on. There's a microscopic parasite which then grows to an adult worm, which is about 3 feet long and lives in the body for 15 years. And during that period, it reproduces, and the body fills up with these millions of microscopic worms that migrate throughout the body just below the skin, and causes intense, unbearable itching, where people, 24 hours a day, where people can't sleep at night. It impacts the children who go to school, who are constantly scratching, and those who want to work in the fields. It inhibits that, prevents people from sleeping at night, and from all reports, people were committing suicide because of the unbearable itching. It also caused severe skin disease, unsightly skin disease, which had negative effects, particularly for teenage girls and their prospects for marriage. And it also, and the average age of blindness for people who had the disease was 30 years. So many of these people were going blind when they were in their peak productive years of life. And while it wasn't a disease that had gotten a lot of attention because it did not exist in the developed world, and in the developing world it was really almost solely in Africa. 99% of onchocerciasis, or river blindness, existed in Africa. There was a small amount in Latin America, but it was not nearly as severe. So I took on the responsibility of, as the World Bank manager of the river blindness program.
And when was this? At what point now are we?
This this was 1985.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I moved to the World Bank in 82. I was in the evaluation department from 82 to 85, and then took on the job of the manager of the river blindness program in 85. I stayed with that for 21 years. That was really my career, and until I retired. It was, I stuck with it because it was so gratifying to watch this program scale up over time. When I started, it was only covering 7 countries in the Sahel region, 7 African countries, all landlocked countries. Basically Burkina Faso, Niger, Ivory Coast, Ghana, Mali, and a confined area, about portions of 7 countries. And while I worked on the problem, and my responsibility was also to keep the program going by making sure that the contributions came in from donor countries around the world. And at the time, the program had, at the time I had about 9 donors. And I was able to increase the donor community, double the size of the donor community while I worked on this, because the program was quite successful as it began. It was started in '74, started by Robert McNamara, and by the time I started working on the program, it had been 10 years, and already it was apparent that it was making inroads on the disease. But what we found out while I was working on it was that the disease persisted, despite the fact that we had a fleet of helicopters that were spraying. The helicopters were spraying insecticides in the rivers where the black fly was breeding in those countries to prevent the black fly from reproducing, biting, and transmitting the disease. And as long as the black fly didn't exist, then there would be no disease to transmit. And so, in theory, if there was no black fly, eventually the disease that was in the bodies of the people would die out over time, because the adult worms would only live for 15 years, and after that point would just die off, and they no longer reproduced. However, we were discovering that disease persisted in those areas, was persisting, and we concluded that the black flies were infected black flies were coming in from outside that program, that 7-country program area. So we decided to increase the size of the program and extend it all the way to the west coast of Africa, to include Guinea, Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, and Sierra Leone, and extended it further south on the west coast down to almost the ocean for Ghana and Ivory Coast. By doing that, we were able to cover the limits of the breeding size of the black fly, and then we, rather than simply a control program, it would become an elimination program, because it was clear that if we could continue to control the disease in that 11-country area, as it now became, over a long enough period of time, the disease would completely die out, and we could stop insecticide spraying, and the disease would not come back. So by 2002, we actually reached that point. And in between, Merck, a pharmaceutical company in New Jersey, discovered that a drug that they had been producing for animals to kill off parasites in dogs and horses and cattle would also work against river blindness with no side effects. And they looked to the donors to possibly purchase the drug so that we could incorporate it in the river blindness program. Well, these were the poorest countries, literally the poorest countries in the world. And the people in those countries were the poorest of the poor, because they were the ones living in the rural areas, living on subsistence agriculture. And there was very little chance that they were going to buy this drug. The drug was called ivermectin. And so Merck eventually agreed to give it free. They decided to give it free, which became the largest drug donation program in the world at the time.
Wow.
And they gave the drug free, and we incorporated it into the onchocerciasis control program for West Africa. So once the drug became available, I realized that we could now possibly begin control operations in the other parts of Africa where insecticide spraying with a fleet of helicopters was no longer possible. Those areas were covered by heavy forest. You couldn't get underneath the forest to spray. And besides, those areas were about 4 times the size of the West African area, and the cost would have been prohibitive to keep what was called a vector control operation going in those areas. Vector control meaning the helicopter spraying. But we could deliver the drug in those areas. It was free, but we had to find a way to reach people living in these very remote rural areas with this drug. And since it had almost no side effects at least that we could detect, we decided that the best way to go about it would be to set up what was called community-directed treatment, to have a volunteer from each of the communities that was adversely affected by the disease deliver the drug to the members of the community. And we would make sure that the communities got the drug, and the community itself would decide who that person would be to deliver the drug, someone they had confidence in, and to make sure that person would deliver the drug to everyone who needed it. And that person would know everybody in the community, and would know, for example, if a woman was pregnant, when she would deliver, and when he could go back and provide the drug, because the drug was not possible for women who were pregnant. Or if someone was traveling, when that person would come back and could get the drug. And the drug only had to be given once a year. So we started delivering the drug, getting the drug to the communities, and having the communities deliver the drug. And we started a program that was really project-based, community-based, in 16 more countries beyond the 11 that were in West Africa. And these countries were in East Africa, Central Africa, and Southern Africa. And this new program was called the African Program for Onchocerciasis Control, and it was launched in 1995 at the World Bank and chaired by the president of the World Bank, Jim Wolfenson. That was very exciting for me, because I was able to see all the endemic countries in Africa covered by this program, and the donors were more enthusiastic because they could see actually an end to this disease in Africa.
How rewarding a career!
Yeah, it was exciting, and we then in the process of establishing this new program, we were able to expand the donor community from it was 19 donors up to 27, and we had donors from Western Europe, Middle East, Asia, and North America.
That's great.
And part of my job was going around to all these countries and giving presentations to the ministries of development cooperation, or the ministries of foreign affairs, about the program and requesting certain levels of contributions based on what we determined was needed by the program, and persuading these donors to stay on board with the program, and often to go back and give them updates on how the program was proceeding and the progress that was being achieved. And it was a program that was quite popular with the donors, so I didn't have that much difficulty in bringing in the necessary contributions. But I had to bring in about $30 million a year to keep the programs going.
That's great.
And when I finished up my work on the river blindness programs in 2006, when I look back, I had raised about $750 million from donors.
Amazing.
For that program, to keep it going. It's still going today. I retired in 2006, mandatory retirement age at the World Bank. I'm 62, and I would have loved to have stayed on to watch this program keep going. It's still going. It has ended in West Africa and was successful, and the disease no longer exists in West Africa except for Sierra Leone, where there had been, in Sierra Leone there had been a civil war going on at the time I was working on the program, and that delayed program operations there. Eventually we were able to go back in with the drug and start up control activities. So that got delayed, and Sierra Leone is a bit behind the other countries, but the disease no longer exists in the other 10 countries in West Africa. It's still going on in Central Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa, but significant progress is being made. Last year, the drug was delivered to about 150 million people, through 150,000 communities.
That's great.
So it's
all the point people.
Sorry?
All the point people in
Yeah,
the communities.
in the various communities. And there was the realization after that if these those responsible for delivering ivermectin could also deliver any other drugs that the community members might need. And it turns out there was a contribution for lymphatic filariasis, which is the same disease as elephantiasis, huge swelling of the legs, the limbs, and that's transmitted by a mosquito, and the drug for that disease came on stream later from GlaxoSmithKline, and eventually we piggybacked that on the delivery of ivermectin through these communities. So we were hitting 2 neglected tropical diseases, and there is also the possibility now of piggybacking other drug donations for several other important neglected tropical diseases, including trachoma, schistosomiasis, and there are about 3 intestinal worm diseases which can be addressed through a drug donation contribution from Johnson & Johnson. So it's the onchocerciasis control program has made a big difference to the rural poor in Africa.
Sure,
Definitely.
absolutely. Well, thanks for all you did too.
And it was a great program for me to have been able to work on. And most bank staff don't get to spend more than 20 years on the program they're working on, but
it's terrific. Yeah.
they agreed to allow me to keep working on it because it was achieving such progress. And then in the year 1997, Jim Wolfenson agreed to have a statue put in the atrium of the World Bank. It's a statue of a young boy leading an elder who's blind with a stick, which is a very common sight you used to see all over Africa. And that statue, life-size statue, is in the atrium of the World Bank. And I worked with the sculptor to have it done and put up in the World Bank.
The next time I'm there, I'll look for it.
You look for it.
That's great.
And then I got an identical statue from the same sculptor put up outside of the World Health Organization in Geneva. And that's at the entrance of the World Health Organization, Geneva.
That's great.
So you have to look for those statues.
Absolutely.
And on the base of the statue, it gives the story of the river blindness program.
Great.
And then in the year 2000, Wolfenson decided to give me a special presidential award for the work on the program. And I was the only individual that's ever been selected by the bank for an award. They usually give them to teams, which is really how the World Bank does most of its work, in teams. And so it's very appropriate for teams. But he singled me out to give a special presidential award.
Congratulations.
In 2000.
Yeah, that's great. Well, tell us, now that you've had such an illustrious career of, like you said, sort of starting in one place and then ending a 21-year block working on one thing, eradicating a disease in multiple countries. What advice might you have today for current students at SAIS?
My own experience was I felt that being as broad as I could in my education, international education, that being African studies, economics, extremely important, extremely important. And for me, having gotten a degree in addition to my MA at SAIS helped a great deal. And I had also worked on courses in international organizations when I was here at SAIS. And as it wound up, my work on the river blindness program happened to involve coordinating the program among 4 international organizations: the World Bank, the World Health Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and UNDP. So that was great preparation for me to be able to work easily among those organizations and to make sure that coordination among them was smooth. And I chaired the committee, the committee of those 4 organizations that kept the program going and continued the oversight of the programs, the river blindness programs, over time. So I think that was important for me. African studies was very important in that I wanted to continue to work on Africa. Economics and economic development. Of course, economics courses were also important in the trade area because I wound up working on trade. So I have to say that most everything that I did at SAIS was of great use to me. I didn't seek it out, but during my career I ran into it and found that using what I had, the education I had gotten at SAIS was extremely valuable to me. And
so try to get a broad range under your belt while you're here.
Yeah.
Because you don't know when you're going to use it.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
That's great.
And I preferred to go horizontally rather than vertically, if you will. Rather than, say, getting a PhD and going really deep into one area. going horizontally, I found, enabled me to have a number of jobs in the international area over my career and be quite successful at them. And each time I switched to a new job, I could draw on the experience, both of my education and the previous experience I'd had in other jobs. So it built up over time. So
Thank you.
I hope that helps.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for spending some time with us
All
today.
right, I enjoyed it, Jordy.